Доброго дня, шановні колеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We continue work in the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. Now we will have the presentation of Chatham House.
Manager Ukrainian Forum Chatham House and Janet Gunn, independent expert. Unfortunately, Timothy Ash couldn't make it due to weather conditions. Ladies, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand that you all speak English and nobody needs the interpretation. Is that correct? Okay, great. So welcome. My name is Orysia Lutsevych. I manage a relatively new program at Chatham House called Ukraine Forum. And just for the start, to explain that Chatham House is one of the oldest European think tanks that has been established in 1921, and the full name is the Royal Institute of International Affairs, but it's an independent, it's not a state institute. It's funded by different sources, private, government, foundations. And we've set up Ukraine Forum 2 years ago with the aim after Euromaidan, and when we saw that there was quite active Western involvement in assisting in Ukraine's transformation, to explain domestic trends, dynamics, drivers, and obstacles to reforms. So up to date, we've set up around 35 all kinds of events and roundtables in London and in other European capitals by bringing Ukrainian voices to Europe, to London. Those who are in charge of reforms in government, in parliament, in civil society, and in media, to explain to Western audiences how Ukraine works. Because there's a lot of misconceptions and myths, and a lot of Western researchers, media, and policymakers are still looking at Ukraine either through the post-Soviet lens or through the Russian lens, and, you know, in a way are looking for more similarities. And we believe it's important to understand the differences. So we have released this report, which is a major report that we've put to date, which is an effort of 7 people, which, from what I hear myself, is the first account of Ukraine after Euromaidan in the Western Research Center. It covers a sway of issues from security and foreign policy to European integration process, to economic reform, to democratic consolidation and party systems, to civil society and anti-corruption. So it's quite a substantial account. We've tried to reach out to as much Ukrainian audience as possible. An executive summary of this report is translated into Ukrainian and into Russian. We are lucky to receive funding from the Swedish government, and actually our outreach trip both in Ukraine and in the regions of Ukraine next year, we are planning to go to Odessa, to Kharkiv, to Dnipro and Lviv, is paid by the Swedish government because, as you know, they're quite involved in Ukrainian reforms. So this was as a way of introduction. So now I will pass the floor to my colleague Janet Gunn, whose chapter was about domestic politics very much, about democratization, and she will share some of her main conclusions from the chapter. Janet.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be back in Kiev. I came from a snowy London, so it wasn't a shock. As Orysia said, a lot of the information in the report is actually information as well as analysis, for the simple reason that Ukraine does not hit the headlines very often in Britain and in other European countries, West European countries, possibly because it does hit the news when there's bad news, which tends to be the case across the board. Nothing we can do about that. But I don't need to tell any of you what's been going on in Ukraine in the last 3 years. You know it all much better than me. So I will say a little bit about the conclusions we've drawn, in particular in the chapter I wrote, which is about governance and parties and mass media. Basically what we see is a huge amount of progress. There are reforms being introduced and implemented across a very wide range of topics. This is an enormous challenge for any political structures, for a parliament, for a government, and for all the other institutions of state, such as the judiciary. So very often the question is asked, are we expecting too much? Are we expecting things to happen faster than is realistically possible? That is all very debatable. But there is one thing that is clear, that the outside world perceives that it is in Ukraine's interest, above all, to maintain the momentum, to maintain a forward direction. And it is a matter of great concern to everybody when there appears to be backsliding or pushing back from reform. That said, if there is pushback, one conclusion from it could be that this means the reforms are biting. They are actually having an effect, and they're affecting certain interests in the country who don't like it. So that can be seen as a positive as well as a negative. But at that point, what is required is very strong political will and political leadership from the very top levels of government and the legislature to keep things moving forward and to ensure that what is decided is the right thing and what is decided is implemented. Now, I will just run through a list of what I perceive to have been some of the major achievements in the last 3 years. It's a very impressive list. First of all, and we shouldn't forget this, there has been relative stability of government for over 3 years. The next elections are not due until 2019. Last year we saw some hints and rumors and theories that there might be early elections, but on the whole, this is now gone and there has been stability. There has been a large amount of legislative and constitutional change, more than happened in the previous 23 years or so. There has been a certain amount of renewal of the political class. There are new people have entered the radar, people who are younger, people who come from different walks of life and are not out of the normal political class. There is a vibrant civil society pushing for reform, helping the reformists in the legislature and in government, in many ways in very hands-on types of work, such as drafting new laws, involvement in verification of appointments of new judges, and so on. There have been steps towards improvement of public administration, including open competition for some posts in the civil service, in the judiciary, and particularly in the new organizations that are dealing with corruption. There's been the establishment of a public broadcaster. There are questions over whether its budget is sufficient, but this is an important step forward. There are new ways of funding political parties. This process isn't complete, but it is also a step forward. And last but not least, electoral reform has finally been initiated, but has only passed at the first reading and has a long way to go before being adopted, and there's no guarantee that it will be adopted in the optimal form. I have spent quite a number of weeks over the past 10 years in different parts of Ukraine as an election observer, working in the OSCE framework, and it has always struck me as very strange that the Central Electoral Commission and other electoral commissions are appointed on a party affiliation basis. This is strange to me because in my country, elections are run by civil servants. These are people who may have their own, they do have their own political sympathies. They vote for one or another party in elections, but they put that completely on one side in their work. And they are independent. So there is no jockeying for, has this party got enough influence, has that party got enough influence? Elections really should be run on a completely independent basis. This is a long way off in Ukraine, and that points to an underlying factor which we perceive both from public opinion surveys and from the reactions in the public to events, political events in Ukraine, and that is the lack of trust. Well, many countries experience a lack of trust in politicians. It's pretty high, lack of trust is pretty high in Britain at the moment because of this Brexit business that is so vexatious. But public trust in Ukrainian institutions and political parties is exceptionally low, and that is a sign that something needs to change. Because after all, it is the public who vote these people into power, and the public therefore deserves better. Now, this is a good list of progress, and it's not complete, I'm sure. But the key question is, are these changes irreversible, and are they still moving forward? And quite independently, the 7 authors of this report concluded, all of them concluded, it's not certain that these reforms are irreversible. They could stop, they could go backwards. This is the key issue I would stress today. The outside world wants to see Ukraine succeed and wants to see progress forwards. One of the key areas, as I don't need to tell you, is measures against corruption. It's very sad that in the public image, Ukraine is associated internationally with corruption. Corruption exists pretty much everywhere, but when it is systemic, as it is in a number of countries, this actually simply affects the welfare of the people of that country. Because a certain number of people are doing very well and becoming very rich, and the others are not doing well. So rule of law is the main instrument by which corruption can be dealt with across the board. We've seen many areas in which the space for corruption has been reduced. Key areas, the energy industries, particularly gas, the banking sector. These are areas where there's much less space for corruption, and this should improve in the future as well. Other areas it's not happened yet, like privatization of the huge number of not very effective state enterprises. Business and politics have no business being together. Businessmen might be in politics, though it seems a little odd for this to happen, but if they are, their business interests should have no bearing on their voting and their decision-making in politics. I haven't mentioned judicial reform. That is ongoing, but is still partial. It's not complete. The judiciary has a long way to go to become the essential underpinning of the rule of law, which is an independent judiciary. Then, anti-corruption. Somebody else wrote the chapter on this. He's not here today. But everybody has been much concerned at the events of the last couple of weeks in Ukraine. It's not easy to see what is exactly happening because, as with so often, what you see on the surface does not always show what is going on under the covers. But it is giving rise to a cause for concern. On the one hand, as I said earlier, this shows probably that the reforms are biting, they are having an effect. But they raise questions as to whether the new organizations dealing with corruption are going to be allowed to do their job and to move forward so that we finally see some actual prosecutions and convictions for corruption, which haven't taken place so far. There have been arrests and then nothing. Everything just goes into the sand. So that is the moment at which we've come to Ukraine, which I think underlines our conclusions that nothing is yet certain. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Janet. Maybe to share with you a bit also behind the covers of the preparation of this report. Frankly speaking, it took us very long to decide on a cover image, because we wanted to communicate the struggle, but not too violent. We wanted to communicate the importance of the institutions in Ukraine, struggle and governance, and that's why we settled on a picture that is a bit outdated, frankly. I understand that, you know, Savchenko is out of prison, but I think it shows also the importance of parliament and the new political class that you see many of the new MPs are around the podium in moving Ukraine forward. My chapter was about civil society, and this is something I've been doing in Ukraine for a while. I'm, you know, as you can guess, Ukrainian myself, and I've been involved in various technical assistance programs and questions always that I ask is, what is the impact of civil society? And again, my chapter wasn't describing overall the legislative environment and things like that, but it was asking what was the contribution of Ukrainian non-state sector in changing Ukraine after Euromaidan. And of course, I mean, I must say Ukrainian volunteer associations, NGOs, active citizens have lots of reasons to be proud of what they have contributed to major areas of Ukraine's transformation. I think also it was a certain moment that allowed this input to be effective. And that means the new leadership that came because of the social protests, and there was a certain you know, pressure that they have to cooperate to save their faces, because their trust to all those leaders was quite low. So in a way, civil society landed its trust dividend to the new president, to the prime minister, and they were, I would say, at the beginning of transformation, very constructive in their cooperation. They brought a lot of you know, know-how, a lot of draft laws to put on the table. And it's striking that, you know, reanimation reform package that's set up, that many of you know, has such a title. Reanimation is a place where patience is usually for a short period of time. And when they came together as a network, they thought it will be a short period of time. The government will pass all the laws we have, and the struggle will be over. So I think it's quite telling, the very title of a Ukrainian advocacy network. I guess right now we're coming to an understanding that this will take long time. And I guess the good question to ask right now, under the current, you know, in the current political culture, in the current constellation of political forces, before the upcoming elections, how can civil society best continue to build this upward pressure, mobilize citizens, and push for reforms? When we travel with this report in European capitals, and so far we've been to Brussels and we've been to Berlin, we hear a lot of concern, we hear a lot of questions. How can the West best help Ukraine? And we hear a lot of hope for Ukrainian civil society. We always hear from policymakers saying, but Ukraine has such a strong civil society, and they are our best allies in moving Ukraine forward. And I agree to that. I think Ukraine has, if you look at the former Soviet space, the most vibrant civil society. And even if you compare Ukraine's voice and expression of civil society, it's high in Bulgaria, it's as high as in Poland and Romania. So indeed, in the formal indicators, we have to be, you know, confident in this. But maybe today I want to talk a little bit about weaknesses, the way I see them, and the way I come to the conclusion based on my survey, that in my chapter I surveyed over 160 Ukrainian NGOs. And what I've noticed is, already back in the summer, because the survey was done in the summer, that there was quite a lot of anxiety, anger, and sort of disbelief that this government is ready for public consultations, is ready to sit at the table and discuss reforms. There was the time when the NGOs noticed that the government is closing down, that many decisions are taken behind the closed doors, and they have no input. And the majority of them said, there's a chart on page, I think, 68, where what are the best ways to influence policy making? And they say, go to media, organize people for the protest, mobilize citizens to exert pressure. And I think this is quite symptomatic of what is happening right now today around, you know, Saakashvili. Yeah, it's page 68. Which forms of civic action is the most effective in the current political system? So if you compare more institutionalized ways to discuss public consultations, individual, contacts with the government officials, or advocacy, which is, a way to promote policy change, it's much less than protests, mobilizing, and sharing information with media, which means the only way they see their impact is through indirect pressure. And this, I think, is something to work on in the future, because we cannot, as a sector, as civil society sector, rely on just individual political will of some government officials, as it was after Euromaidan. Ukrainian civil society needs institutional ways to be included in policy making so that policy is public and transparent. And this means law and public consultations, it means stakeholder associations, it means that Ukrainian NGOs have to go out and reach out to citizens, because frankly overall society is quite automized, There are not structures that would really represent teachers, doctors, farmers, beyond the official trade unions, which we know are a bit captured by the industry. So I would really call on this action to strengthen the pressure from below by reaching out to citizens, because we must remember democracy, at the center of democracy is a citizen. Like Janet was saying, public trust is dramatically low in Ukraine, and political class cannot restore this trust. It's only, opinion makers, it's only volunteers, it's only people who have proven that they can work in the public interest, that they can be seriously treated by citizens, and they can, I think, one of the ways that Ukrainian civil society has to operate, especially before the upcoming election, is to convene in a safe way forums of citizens, public discussions, events even like this, where we don't need to have government representative present. We can just build a common knowledge together. And it has been also proven by various studies that when citizens share the common knowledge, it is much more powerful in changing the social norm than rather than individually, reading some news or discussing it with your family in the kitchen. Because when you know that other citizens have the same information, you change your behavior, you operate in a different way, because you understand that this is becoming a new norm. So I will finish here just to mention one more last thing, and that is about Western funding in Ukraine, because we do know that a lot of advocacy work is funded by Western funders, by USAID, by EU Commission, by foundations, by Open Society, Renaissance Foundation here. And I think it's great that they can support those groups, but until those groups reach out also to citizens, to middle class, and get them on board of those policy changes, government will not be responsive, because they ask a question of legitimacy. And I think there's a key question of legitimacy of civil society in Ukraine, especially in the anti-corruption sector. And if you notice, this shameful, I think, law on anti-corruption NGOs and e-declarations, what was the reaction of society? Society was either silent or in a way supporting this kind of measure. So I think Ukrainian anti-corruption sector has to explain better itself to civil society and to citizens, and mobilize funding for its action. So we'll stop here, because I think there will be lots of interesting questions in the audience, and I guess the microphone will be going around, and we would love to discuss some of those points with you, what you think. And
could I just ask, are we being interpreted or not? I've guiltily seen the sign saying slow down, slow down. It's all in English. Is there interpretation or not?
Yes.
Oh, I'm very sorry, I spoke too fast.
Чи є запитання в залі?
I have a question. I'm Maria from Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and I'd better ask in Ukrainian because I'm not sure I'll be clear enough in English.
About 3 years ago, I remember in one of the interviews, I don't remember with whom, with some Ukrainian activists, they said that Francis Fukuyama, known foreign researcher, that he said that in order that real changes started in the country, it is important that activists would come to institutions of power, and they should be the drivers of change there. And do we have such chances to contribute to these changes as non-governmental organizations, or we should just gather and we should break the system and become politicians ourselves? Whether we can work as we are now, or we should shift from the civil sector to politics. I mean, those people who want positive transformations in Ukraine.
I'll speak more slowly now for the poor interpreter. One of the plus points that I think omitted to mention was the decentralization. The process of amalgamating very, very small communes into entities that can actually have some powers and some tax-raising competence potentially can make a big difference to both public engagement and to the standard of governance in Ukraine. If everything is top-down in the old Soviet style, then the public don't feel involved. They can't see how decisions are taken. They don't see who is running governance in their region. And one area, I think, has potential for new political activists to join politics could be through the new hromady, because when they are successful at local level and they achieve something for their communities, better roads, better schools, better health care, and so on, and show that they are not corrupt and that the money that they raise through taxes is actually spent for the benefit of the community, this is how trust can build up and confidence, and could give them a kind of springboard from which they could join political life at higher levels, having proved themselves maybe at local level. But even at the central level, we have seen new people from civil society joining political life. There are many new people in the Rada. The problem for them is, are they accepted? Are they listened to? Or do they get sucked into the old methods of working? Or do they give up and go back to their old professions because it's not working? But I would hope to see more and more new people in politics, a new generation, not just in terms of age, but in terms of background and trustworthiness and integrity. Orysia.
I think in Ukraine for decades now, Ukraine suffered from the negative selection in government. And this is something that after Euromaidan we've noticed was the kind of the first instance where positive selection started to take place, where people were coming not just from civil society and NGOs, but also from the private sector. And I think there was also an influx of people from the private sector into executives, into the parliament as well, to take positions and to serve public good. I think this is something fundamental for Ukraine, is to have members of parliament, is to have government officials who understand what public good, not personal good, is when they are taking offices. I think it's important for any democratic system to have very healthy and vibrant civil society. I think even if some people from civil society decide to move into politics, which, you know, I think this is a one way where you can have an elite, you know, refreshment in Ukraine. This is a good pool of human capital where people should take an opportunity. But I think that this has to happen in parallel with the creation of new political structures, new political parties. Because existing political parties invited some of the civil society after Euromaidan, but they are operating by the same old rules. There's no party democracy, there's no party accountability, and I think that, I mean, if I were a civil society actor and there would be such a dilemma for me, I would only go into politics with a new political party. It's a more difficult way, but I think it's a more true way, it's a more sustainable way for the long term of Ukraine. And if you look at our reports at the political party rating and the striking number of more than 50% Ukrainians who will either spoil the ballot, who don't know who to vote for, or who will vote against everybody. And I think this is the you know, it's half of Ukrainian electorate that is lost, that has no representation. I mean, Ukraine is a democracy, but I don't think it's a representative democracy. That's why I believe that next election will be crucial in a way of whether the new post-Euromaidan class, middle class, people from civil society decide to go into politics, but in a new way, not in the old way, like they did after Euromaidan.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Well, I'm Pavlo Tus from Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and I'd like to clarify one issue. So, obviously, you don't like the top-down approach to exercising pressure on Ukrainian authorities because, well, it's not fully legitimate. But the recent developments around the NABU, its interagency conflict with the Prosecutor's General Office, with the SBU, has showed that external pressure is way more effective and it might end up way more efficient as well. So why shouldn't we use it more for, well, not on a permanent basis, but for this transitional period of time?
I never say, yeah, I think there may be miscommunication. We didn't say that I mean, the report actually argues for more Western pressure and for more tougher conditionality and actually calls for Western assistance and governments to keep Ukraine on the top policy priority because the outcome in Ukraine will have an impact on the whole region and for what will happen in Russia, and we argue exactly for that. But I think that just the Western pressure is not enough. That's why I was talking more about the bottom-up also pressure. And in the West, often they talk, Ukraine is like a reform sandwich, that you have local pressure, then you have external pressure, and then you have Ukraine's political class that, you know, it's a narrowing opportunity for obstructing reform process. And I think it has to continue. The risk is that the Western leverage is weakening because of the IMF reform program looks like it's off track. Ukraine just entered the international markets with the Eurobond, so they're not so desperate for new capital. The visa facilitation, the visa liberalization process happened. So the question is, what are the remaining carrots that they can put on the table for Ukrainian leadership to bite on? That's why I think we will be seeing the next 2 years where this domestic pressure has to increase because it will be up to Ukrainians. We have to accept a higher level of responsibility, understanding that the Western pressure they will try to exert it, but it will be weaker because of the circumstances I mentioned.
I think, yes, absolutely. Well, we didn't say at all that we don't believe that external pressure at the top levels is not important. It is important. But you have to consider that there could come a time when what we call Ukraine fatigue sets in. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world at the moment. Ukraine is not the only issue. And if the results do not appear, then, you know, the outside world could just get fed up. We always talk about carrots and sticks as, you know, incentives and punitive actions as the way to exercise pressure. But this bit in the middle of the sandwich, which sounds insignificant, but is actually the Ukrainian political class, is not a passive actor in this. It should not be simply subject to pushing and pressure from below and from above. It should seize the initiative itself. After all, it's been elected to govern Ukraine. What we would like to see is leadership and ownership at those levels, in the Verkhovna Rada, in the government, in the presidency, across the board, to take reform forward, to show that they mean it, and that they understand how important it is for Ukraine. Ukraine is a country under attack, after all. Ukraine's very existence as a fully sovereign state has been cast into doubt. Its territory has been taken from it. This is a situation in which Ukraine has to be very strong, and in many ways it has been. It has fought back, both on the military platform and the public have fought back. I think nobody expected volunteering and other forms of social initiative to play such a major role. It shows that the people of Ukraine are patriots. They really want a better Ukraine. But after all, they are a representative democracy. They elect people to govern them. They are the ones on whom the main responsibility lies.
Yeah, and just to point you, there's the in the executive summary a set of a summary of recommendations, and Kasia Volchuk, who wrote on the effectiveness of EU assistance and role of association agreement, she actually argues for more tailored assistance to Ukraine rather than more technical approach. She calls for more vocal, role for the European institutions and more political, the understanding that the processes are political, they are not technical, that Ukraine does not really have strong institutions that can implement a lot of those changes, and every step in creating those institutions is the political conflict. It's not the preset, environment ready to implement association agreement. Every step is political conflict, and we now face the conflict between prosecutors and NABU, and we'll see other conflicts. In a way, I think there's no society without conflict, unless it's a real totalitarian society. I think Ukrainians have to accept conflict as part of democratic protracted struggle in a way, because I think it was Karl Popper who said, conflict is inherent in every society. We are not ants, we are human beings. So the fact that there is this conflict, it's a good sign, but it means that those reforms, those institutions have to be protected if they matter for Ukrainians. Western funding and conditionality and know-how, technical assistance helped to establish NABU. Now it's up to Ukrainians to defend it, if Ukraine needs NABU.
Just a small remark. So you told that the European Union, the US, might run out of carrots. But, the system of carrots and sticks in Ukraine seems to work like this. So carrot is an incentive for civil society to exert pressure, even beyond its powers. And the sticks are the ones you beat the Bankova and the government with. So, and that's actually what happened a few days ago when, we weren't provided with any positive stimuli there. It was a maybe fear of failing to re-elect. So isn't there enough carrots in the arsenal of the European Union and the US? Thanks.
I think there have been a lot of carrots. There's been budget support, there have been credits, there have been and all the cost of the technical assistance that has come in. The IMF has provided loans, and the visa liberalization was one of the aspects of conditionality. Well, it's been given. Ukrainians can now travel without visas for up to 90 days, I think it is, in the European Union Schengen area. You can't give it twice. You know, there has been a balance in carrots and sticks. The whole point was conditionality, but we shouldn't lose sight of this, the fact that this is not just for the West, this is for Ukraine. This is for Ukraine's future as a strong state with strong institutions. And there's only so much that the outside world can do. I mean, when I talked of Ukraine fatigue, I didn't want to say that sort of next week or next month the US and the EU, and don't forget Canada, it's a very important supporter of Ukraine, that they're just going to lose interest and give up, because they also want a successful Ukraine. But, you know, everybody wants to see Ukraine making the main Herculean effort in this.
My name is Vasyl Miroshnochenko. I'm a co-founder of Ukraine Crisis Media Center. I've got a very simple question to you. I understand since the release of this album, you've been on the tour, and I'm just very curious about what was the feedback of the audiences you presented that to so far. I'm not sure you've been to Brussels with that report yet. Okay, so basically, if you could compare the feedback, the discussions you've had in Brussels or London or maybe Berlin by now, have you had a chance to present that to Ukrainian stakeholders? Somebody in the ministries and maybe office of the president. What's their reaction? Do they agree with the analysis? What's next? Do you plan a second report in a year from now, next year or not?
I'll try to help me then reaction, but I start with the easier one. What are our plans? I mean, as I said at the beginning, we're taking this report and we're hoping to get funding to fully translate it into Ukrainian. First of all, to Ukrainian regions. Outside of Kyiv, we'll go to Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Lviv. Because the Ukraine Forum has a dual goal. One is to, of course, inform Western policymakers and media and experts about what's happening in Ukraine, but also to provide us some reflection on Ukraine from the Western mirror, so that Ukrainians, you know, who are reaching out to Western ally. I mean, the West is an ally for Ukraine now in its fight with Russia, understands how it is perceived, what are its maybe best intentions look like in the West. And we are not planning any major publication next year because Chatham House releases only 1 or 2 or 3 reports per year. It's a major exercise. It takes us a year to prepare such a publication. But we are planning a policy paper on EU aid effectiveness by Kasia Volchuk, and we are looking at the publication on public sentiments and situation in the Donbass and Crimea, because I think it's important to keep those issues on the agenda. And there are many, the Kyiv strategy, the local, politics, the occupied territories. So that's what we want to look at. Now, on the feedback we receive, I think Chatham House is an independent institute, and it gives us a lot of access and leverage in a way of presenting a view that is neither Ukrainian government nor Western policymakers who, like it or not, in some way, have a high stake in Ukraine's also, succeeding. So sometimes they close an eyes on problems and they don't want to expose them. So people appreciated like the sober and independent analysis. So we see there's demand for that. Second, we've noticed a lot of questions about how best to help Ukraine. I mean, I think there's an understanding now after Euromaidan that, a more typical, more traditional toolbox, it doesn't have much grip. something is working, but it doesn't have much grip. So we are being asked questions: how to improve EU assistance, how to better support civil society. Of course, the anti-corruption chapter is of big interest, and we hear a lot of prioritizing around rule of law. I mean, this is the next big battle in the struggle for Ukraine, is to establish rule of law. I think in Brussels there were some mixed feeling, a bit of a criticism around the technical assistance that is not going through the EU-Ukraine support group, because as you may know, after Euromaidan, EU has set up a special Ukraine task force, so to say, with around 30 people led by Peter Wagner, who is channeling a lot of assistance around reforms. And we think it's a good instrument. The author of the chapter argues to use it more than other technical assistance programs that are dispersed and not very well monitored and effective. Maybe Janet.
Yes, I wasn't in Brussels, I was in Berlin, and I've been in London at presentations of the report. And on the whole, most people agree with the general conclusions, which, as I already said, seem to be much the same through all the chapters, that much has been done in Ukraine, but it needs to maintain momentum, and there is a risk of pushback and a risk of backsliding, and some evidence has been seen of this. And therefore, the question under discussion is always, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty?
Sorry to interrupt. I always say, what is it full with?
And I think actually the answer to that is they're both the same. It depends on your personal disposition, whether you're a pessimist or an optimist. But I think the general conclusion has been that it's still on a knife edge. It's uncertain as to how far, how much further things will go. When the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Mr. Groysman, was in London in July at a conference, he said the reforms we're undertaking cover a massive waterfront, a massive breadth. It's very difficult and it's also very costly to implement so many different reforms at once. There's education reform, there's healthcare reform, there's pension reform. These are outside the sort of fundamental political reforms that I was writing about in my chapter. And this is very true. It is a vast scale. But the important thing is the rule of law and the judiciary. These are the underpinnings of democracy, which if they're not in place, the country cannot progress as a functioning democracy. Now, Orysia has talked about civil society and its role and consultation. A case in point might be the new law on education, which has given rise to a lot of concern in certain countries who are of the same ethnicity as some of the ethnic minorities in Ukraine, who are guaranteed certain rights under the constitution. And in reading about this, I'm not an expert on education reform, but I see that the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe is going to give an opinion on this new law. Why didn't it give an opinion during the drafting stage? Why weren't the communities who speak other languages other than Ukrainian and Russian consulted about this? Why wasn't there widespread consultation in advance and explanation in advance? This is how you carry the public with you, and the public is diverse. Clearly it's a problem if some of the ethnic minorities don't speak adequate Ukrainian to attend university in Ukrainian. That clearly has to be remedied, but sometimes these things need to be staged over a number of years. They can't happen. You know, I can't become a fluent Mandarin speaker next week. It takes time. I don't want to comment on the detail of this law because I'm not a specialist in it, but there are people out there to help with in an advisory role, and the Council of Europe is one of them. The OSCE's High Commissioner on National Minorities has an organization in The Hague who are willing to be consulted on these sort of things. I don't know if they were consulted in the drafting stage, but those communities who are affected by this ought to be consulted as well. And if this were a natural process in the development of new laws, things would be much smoother. And there wouldn't be these sort of reactions and then maybe redrafting and so on. It could all be much easier, but it takes time, of course.
I just have two additions that, Vasil, for you especially would be interested in. I think what we heard a lot in Berlin, not only for foreign ministry, but also from experts, is lack of public communication of reforms. They always say, well, why can't they communicate better what they are doing? And even we in our report say the government and civil society have to communicate better the gains, because there are the gains. The meaning of Prosoro, the decentralization, the fiscal decentralization, the increase of local budgets. So that's one thing. And then another thing we hear is that, but why can't the current leadership get civil society on board? If they want the same things, why can't they be allies, and why can't there be more common front, more common effort? You know, a bit like National Reform Council at the beginning. Of course, it was too heavily leaning on political parties in parliament and government. But I think now it's even, there's now lack of any interaction, and there's kind of opacity of politics, the secrecy where, you know, the laws are being basically put last minute on the table in the parliament, and it causes a lot of anxiety, even though if those laws could be good, you know, but it's not the way to build trust in a low trust society. And of course, in each capital, it depends. For example, in Germany, again, they're very much focused on Normandy process in Minsk. So we shouldn't say we are not discussing Russia. It's simply because our colleague James Sher is not here. And the report has a chapter on aggression on Russia, and we are advocating for sanctions on Russia to be maintained and even strengthened when necessary. So we also discussed that. And again, in Berlin, they were quite interested in decentralization, naturally, because I think the way of the federalization and decentralization are played around Normandy process, they want to see how decentralization is progressing. So there are quite a lot. I mean, I must say, from our engagement, we see the Western policy makings keeping, you know, the hand on the pulse of what's happening in Ukraine, and they really monitor daily what is happening, and are quite informed.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
It might be the last question from me. Before the Ukrainian Revolution and all these events of the last 3 years, we have heard that there was really few information about Ukraine abroad. I mean, information that would be coming directly from Ukraine to the West in foreign languages. How do you see it now? Did the situation change? And is there enough information in foreign languages, in English, maybe in French, in German, to have a general idea of what is going on here, if this person is not expert that is working closely and monitoring closely processes in Ukraine? Thank you.
I think there's more now. More information available in English. I don't know what's available in German and in French. But we have to accept that in most countries, people are most interested in their own country and what's going on there, and journalists mostly cover that. I think there is still a lack of writing, certainly in the British press, about Ukraine. There's very little. Sometimes this is a good thing. I was extremely shocked a couple of weeks ago to see a picture somewhere in the Ukrainian media of a young judge in Poltava who had been beaten. This is incomprehensible, that somebody would use violence against a representative of the judiciary. This would not be very good publicity for Ukraine if it did appear in our press. I don't think it did, and that's probably a good thing. But there is always a risk that the negative will be shown more than the positive. And it's, you know, reform is a gradual process. It's when something significant happens that maybe foreign media might be more likely to comment. But as I said earlier, there's an awful lot going on in the world at the moment, and you know, we don't get much news in Britain about what's happening in France, except when they had a presidential election last year. Then, you know, that tends to be more covered than ordinary routine events. But that's a close neighbor of ours. I suspect that the Polish press possibly covers Ukraine more than our own. The US has its own preoccupations at the moment, and the US press is very focused on one particular topic. And of course in Britain we also have our own particular topic. But it's difficult to say. I think this is something that is problematic, and I'm not sure how Ukraine can get more publicity out there. I think the fact that there are, you know, more English language websites now are very helpful.
Well, I think definitely there's an increase of information thanks to non-state initiatives, and that's the truth. I mean, the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, the Ukraine World List, and Internews, they are doing the job very often of a state in reaching out about the events in Ukraine. I think the strategic communication of Ukrainian government has been poor, frankly speaking, both of Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, and I think because of the asymmetric nature of the conflict with Russia, Ukraine has to have an asymmetric response. And this means more public diplomacy and more soft power. Ukraine is not known for its strong, you know, culture, contemporary culture, history. Ukraine has to make itself loved, you know, there has to be an empathy. Ukraine has to work to develop an empathy in Western cultural communities, you know, policymakers, experts, to love Ukraine for what it is. And there are plenty of things that Ukraine could be impressive. And I think if you look at the budget of public diplomacy of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, I mean, last year it was 200,000 euro. I don't know exactly what was approved in this budget, but this is definitely not fit for purpose. It will be much cheaper to do the kind of soft power outreach in the West than even to, we spend 5%, of course, of GDP on defense. This soft power is the same defense as tanks and building frontline reinforcements in the East. So I would really like to see much more and hope that this Ukrainian institute that was just set up as a Ukrainian foreign institute to promote Ukrainian culture really gets on its feet strong and promotes Ukrainian culture and history outside of Ukraine.
Could I just add to that, that of course public diplomacy by governments is always met with a certain degree, quite rightly, a degree of skepticism because it can be seen as propaganda. This is why it needs to be very, very carefully designed, and it should be designed to show not how well the government has done, but how good news stories from society, to familiarize the outside world with what happens in Ukraine. For example, a story about one of the newly amalgamated communities. What happens there? I mean, I know that there are some greater successes and some less successful ones, but news stories about life in Ukraine that are not simply through the lens of government, the government showing how good it is.
Thank you very much for the briefing and for the questions. Are there any more questions? I think we're also running out of time. Thank you very much again. Hopefully we'll see you soon.
And thank you very much, Ukraine Crisis Media Center, for hosting us. It's been a pleasure, and we are partners in the Ukraine Forum, so I hope next year we'll keep up the good work. Thank you so much for hosting us.
Thank you.